Greetings and welcome. I'm Karen Beadle from Capital District Border Watch. Capital District Border Watch was formed in February of 2019 as an outgrowth of efforts to protest family separation and detention of asylum seekers. We seek to create new and effective strategies to advocate for human rights in the current landscape. As the crisis simultaneously worsens and becomes less visible, we will continue to act to make the realities of the border present and seen in the capital region. Since planning this event on the rights of asylum seekers, on November 12th, the Supreme Court has taken up the legality of the DACA program that has provided safe harbor for more than 700,000 young people who were brought to the U.S. as children. Their futures now hang in the balance, awaiting a ruling that will be based on legal technicalities, not the immense loss that would result if these young people were to lose their protection and their futures. Last week, the federal government announced that 69,550 children have been detained in 2019. More children are now detained without their parents in the U.S. than in any country in the world. These are heartbreaking statistics to hear, revealing heartbreaking realities for all of these children and their families. This quote is from the Southern Poverty Law Center on the rights of asylum seekers. The Trump administration has enacted policy after policy aimed at eviscerating the legal rights of people seeking asylum and creating the harshest conditions possible for them, with the stated goal of deterring others through the suffering of migrants who have already made the journey. By sabotaging the asylum system, President Trump has made a mockery of the United States' international reputation as a country that respects human rights and the rule of law. We are here tonight to educate ourselves about the changing legal landscape for asylum seekers as a result of Trump's Remain in Mexico policy and the restrictions to asylum caused by administrative orders that require refugees to pursue and be denied asylum in transit countries before applying in the U.S. These possibilities have trapped more than 40,000 refugees in northern Mexico with nowhere to go. Tonight we will hear from Sarah Rogerson about these asylum restrictions, from Ashoka Mukpo about his interviews with refugees trapped at the border, and from Carrie Kuehl about our neighbors to the north and their activism to change Canadian immigration policy. I will be taking notes on ideas that emerge related to how we might mobilize to support asylum seekers. We will have questions and discussion after the presentations related to the issues raised and our response as a community. Sarah Rogerson is director of the Immigration Law Clinic at the Albany Law School and initiator of the Detention Outreach Project, a coalition effort which offered legal representation to almost 350 detainees held in the Albany County Jail last fall. She began her legal work in Dallas, Texas, as an asylum attorney in a nonprofit. She is deeply committed to her practice of law that serves the community, and we are lucky to have her in Albany and speaking to us tonight. Sarah.
How many of you are somewhat familiar with the general legal requirements for individuals seeking asylum? About half and half. Yeah, so before Trump, right? But generally, folks who are seeking asylum have to show past persecution or a well-founded fear of future persecution on certain delineated grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. What's missing from that? A whole host of things: gender, sexual orientation, asylum-based or gang-based persecution, lots and lots of claims that just don't fit the bill. And what I want to commend to you to understand what's going on in just over an hour, how many of you are listening to podcasts these days? There's an excellent one. This American Life just did a podcast called The Out Crowd, and I listened to it before I got here today, and it's excellent. It chronicles and they interview asylum officers who are charged with doing these interviews. And they're interviewing specifically the asylum officers who are assigned to the MPP, or migrant protection protocols. We call them migrant persecution protocols. That's the more apt name for what these are. The officers who are resisting from the inside in immigration and saying, you know what, I'm gonna walk off the job. I can't do this. One officer said that she gets sick in the shower every morning, and that she can't sleep at night because she's had to send 100 people back to Mexico under Trump's new asylum rejection regime. So I commend that to you because the podcast starts out with some hope and some action items, and I thought specifically of this group because I'm so when I get sort of downtrodden by the work and I see other attorneys out in the crowd, some of my comrades that work with us here in the Capital District, when it gets really hard, it's folks like you that help us keep going. And there are opportunities for folks like you at the border. You don't have to be a lawyer. There are groups down there that are working in what are now essentially refugee camps. So the policies that have been discussed in the introduction, right? And some of the policies that were affirmed by the Supreme Court on September 11th. They couldn't wait a day. They couldn't make it just a little bit less cruel. As a result of those policies, of Trump's policies that have been upheld, some of them by the Supreme Court, we are creating refugee camps on the other side of the border. About 2,500 people at this point, depending on how you count, at various points of entry. These folks because they're not technically labeled as refugees, because it's just something that we're just starting to get our arms wrapped around. There are no formal government groups, the United Nations, no other countries who are taking care of these folks, who are, tending to the tent camps that have sprung up on the other side of the border, or people waiting to make their claim for asylum in the United States, waiting in line. And some people get to the front of the line and find out you should have applied in Guatemala. You have to go back to the end of the line, or your claim just isn't good enough, and we're gonna send you back to Mexico, and good luck. Before they ever see a judge, they rarely see a lawyer. We'll have one lawyer here who can talk about what the lawyers are doing down on the border. Not a lawyer, but can talk about what the lawyers are doing. But there are people who are filling the role of the United Nations, who are raising money in their communities. In Indianapolis, Indiana, a group of teachers organized to provide food for the day at these refugee camps. And so that's something that can be done. And people are going down. It's not safe. It's a very dangerous place to be. In a lot of these tent camps, there is a lot of gang violence. These are places in Mexico where the government doesn't have a good grip on public safety, and the police are not terribly helpful. So when the sun goes down, they evacuate the volunteers, and folks fend for their lives. I recently wrote a piece in an online journal called The Conversation that has a lot of links to different statistics to arm yourself for your Thanksgiving dinners with maybe your relatives that don't understand what's going on. But in that article, I raised the alarm, and this was right after the Supreme Court case. I said, people are going to die. People are being kidnapped and will be kidnapped. Children will be taken. Cartels will exploit this situation. And that's what's happening. That's exactly what's happening. There are families who are waiting in line who have been kidnapped 1, 2, 3 times. The story, the podcast that I hope you will all listen to because I'm doing a magnificent job of promoting it, chronicles women who ask these volunteer humanitarian aid organizers to bring condoms because ultimately they know that they will be sexually assaulted again, and they want to make sure that their attackers have protection so that they don't get pregnant. That's the type of situation that we have created through our policies on the southern border. And what I want you to understand is that this isn't affecting predominantly individuals from countries in Central and South America. When we ran the Detention Outreach Project and 350 people were brought here to Albany County, straight from the border, they came from 27 different countries. They spoke 11 different languages. There were 22 families that had been separated, 10 parents who had been separated from their children, even though the Department of Homeland Security had promised the Albany County Sheriff that they would not send any family separation cases. It was so chaotic back then, they had no idea. We think they just grabbed a group of people and put them on a plane to Albany, New York. But think about that, 27 countries. And when I worked as an asylum attorney in Dallas, Texas, under, it was the Bush administration, actually. It's not that things were terribly pleasant under that administration or that things worked particularly well, but I learned a whole lot more about how people come here. And I was talking earlier about one of the cases that has stuck with me all these years was a woman who actually worked for the United Nations in her home country, which was in the Horn of Africa. And her government didn't like that. They imprisoned her, tortured her, she fled, she escaped. The only flight that she could get took her on a crazy route, ultimately, if I'm remembering correctly, to Brazil. And then she worked her way up through Brazil. She swam across the Rio Grande when she was 8 months pregnant. And she made it to our office. And after I interviewed her and said, yes, you'll have a lawyer. Yes, we will represent you. Yes, we will take care of this legal case. She gave birth a few days later. And we worked really, really hard on her case and her husband's case. And she gave birth to this beautiful child, and they received status ultimately. That woman never would have made it here under the current situation. And she probably would have died. She certainly wouldn't have been, if she were able to come, it's now a question as to whether or not she would have been able to obtain what's called work authorization. That's the most recent thing that's happened to asylum seekers, is that the Trump administration is now trying to restrict the issuance of work authorization to asylum seekers because they think that asylum seekers are gaming the system in order to work here. I've never met one. I've never met an asylum seeker, and I've met many of them. My whole career started, my very first case as a baby lawyer, as a law student, was representing a man from the Republic of Congo who fled political persecution and lost his entire family. And he showed up in Newark, New Jersey, barefoot, with a phone number of a minister that he could call, and malaria, which took a while for him to work out. I've never met an asylum seeker. I've never represented an asylum seeker. I've never interviewed an asylum seeker and had to turn them down for legal services who said, I came here to work. I fled here, and I now have the opportunity to work to support myself. But typically, actually, what happens is asylum seekers get here, they're trying to figure out their just basic living situation. Where am I going to sleep? How am I going to eat? Who do I know here? Where do I go? They're lucky if they find a lawyer who can help them identify an opportunity to apply for employment authorization, but most are living off the kindness of strangers. Faith groups. One of the organizations I volunteered with in law school is the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, Catholic Charities. These are groups, USCRI, who has an office right here in Albany. These are groups that assist refugees and asylum seekers in figuring out how to navigate this new country that they find themselves in and their newfound safety. So it's puzzling to me why this most recent, I guess it's not puzzling. I guess we know. We see the pattern, right? The pattern is to demonize a group, to blame all of our problems on this group, and then to punish that group. And this is just one more thing that the Trump administration is doing to punish this group. There's also no right to mandated counsel. And under the current administration, it's actually worse. Because like I said, you could be denied asylum without ever seeing a lawyer, without ever going before a judge. And even if you do go before a judge, these days, the hearings on what's called a credible fear interview, which is the first step before you get to the asylum claim itself. The credible fear interview stage was the stage that everybody in the detention outreach project at Albany County Jail was at. They hadn't been interviewed yet. They had just arrived in the United States and they were scooped up and sent to New York. We had to draw maps to tell them where they were because they had no idea and no one had told them where they were going. So we prepared them for those credible fear interviews. We provided them with lawyers to do that. What's now happening, that people aren't making their way across the border, is that these credible fear interviews are happening while they're still detained by asylum officers that are kind of like beamed in to a detention facility. In Albany, we ultimately had a rate of over 95% of success, which meant that people could apply for bond and get out of detention and go be reunited with their family members and pursue their claim for asylum. And that's the way the system is designed. One more plug on the podcast. You'll hear them say in the podcast, and it's totally true, that it was designed this way because we're humanitarians, Americans. We say, if you are fleeing horrors in your home country, we'll let you in first and ask questions later. That's not the case anymore. Credible fear interviews success rates have plummeted. Which means these folks are never, ever even getting to the asylum stage. They're knocked out of the box from the beginning. So the deck is stacked against folks. As I said, we've manufactured this humanitarian crisis, and we're not taking responsibility for it. And until there's more attention being drawn to this, and I hope that's what a lot of this reporting will do. Even back in September, there were human rights reports from nonprofit groups who had been down to the border, had been down to these tent camps to see what was going on. And we're reporting about the kidnappings. We're reporting about what's going on. But post-family separation and in the throngs of impeachment, we're just not talking about it anymore. So keep talking about it. We have to keep raising the issue. We have to keep flagging this. One more thing that I'll say before I pass along, because I said I wasn't going to go 30 minutes, and I think I'm getting pretty close. Before any of this, one of the first things, one of the signals to asylum attorneys, to immigration attorneys, that we knew things were going to be really bad. We knew they were going to be bad. We just didn't know they would be this awful. One of the first signs was there's this wrinkle in the immigration law that says that the Attorney General basically has unlimited discretion to pick any case out of immigration land and make his or her own decision about it. And one of the first times that this happened under this administration was a case called Matter of AB. And what Matter of AB represented was essentially a long, hard, long-fought battle to recognize domestic violence as a basis for seeking asylum. Remember those categories I talked about in the beginning? There's no protection for gender. There's no protection. It's a social group. So if you were fleeing domestic violence, and typically this is an issue that disproportionately impacts women. So a woman would come to the United States and say, especially in cases where the abuser was a police officer or in a position of power in their home country, where they literally could not go anywhere without this man finding them. It was a long, hard fight, and it started with a woman named Rodi Alvarado, whose case I became obsessed with in law school. That case is called Matter of RA. And Matter of AB essentially was sort of the end of the fight to legitimize domestic violence as a basis for seeking asylum. Well, the Attorney General chose that case, pulled it up out of all of the cases that he could choose, and said, no, no more. I am recertifying this case to myself, and I am reissuing my own opinion. And basically, any asylum claims based on domestic violence and gang brutality should, quote unquote, generally no longer be approved, period. And there's a case winding its way through the courts in the United States that I also became obsessed with when I was a practitioner in Texas, because I read about it in a local newspaper headline. It's the case of Maria S. And Maria S. was an asylum seeker who came to the United States seeking asylum based on domestic violence. And the asylum officers the Corrections and Border Patrol officers, Customs and Border Patrol officers who interviewed her when she came over to the United States, they didn't believe her. And they detained her for a prolonged period of time, and they walked her back across the bridge to escort her back across the border. And she said, if I die, it's on your hands. And 2 days later, her abuser murdered her. And her children and her sister filed a lawsuit against the United States because they didn't follow any of the protocols. Unfortunately, the protocols that they didn't follow are all out the window now. So it doesn't mean the case dies. This case is winding its way through the court system. It's a very interesting case because it's about, to what degree can we hold government actors personally, individually liable for the decisions they make, or hold CBP accountable when they make mistakes and violate their own protocols that result in people's death. It's not the only case like that. Another case that was on for oral arguments in addition to the DACA case was the cross-border shooting case. The Supreme Court is another transcript that you gotta read. It's available on the Supreme Court website now, because Sotomayor just rips into the Solicitor General. It's a beautiful thing to read. But it's a case where the Customs and Border Patrol officer essentially on one side of the border shot and killed a kid on the other side of the border, on the Mexico side of the border. And the question is, the legal question, which is not as exciting, is how far, what's the extraterritorial application of the Constitution of the United States, right? How far outside of the border? What is the border? What is that liminal space? You should know it's like it's hundreds of miles wide, but it's also several miles deep. And it's not real clear when you're in it. I hope you'll speak more to that as well. But it's not like a line. It's not like when you go to the 4 states that all connect and they've got the little thing where you can play, four square hopscotch. It's not like that. And so it will be an interesting case about to what degree we can hold government actors liable for what is blatantly, beyond the pale conduct. They said that the kids were throwing rocks, but right, that's disproportionate harm. So these are other cases that I would just encourage you to follow when we're thinking about how to hold our government responsible. There are still things, those are the cases that I hold on to, again, when I'm having a bad day as a lawyer, that sometimes lawyering can make a difference. Maybe at some point we'll reach a breakthrough on some of these cases, but until then, we need people to be loud about what's happening, people who care, and people who are willing to go down to the border and help. And I don't have the names of the organizations, but there are 2 or 3 that are named. So thank you for coming tonight. It shows that you care. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have afterwards.
Thank you, Sarah. Ashoka Mukpo is staff reporter for the ACLU.
He traveled to Ciudad Juarez and Matamoros in October to document the stories of refugees trapped at the border by increasingly more punitive immigration policies. He's a former freelancer based out of West Africa, reporting on politics and culture for NPR, Al Jazeera, Vice, and others. Tonight he's traveled from New York City to share his experience with us. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have to admit that I'm not even quite sure how much I can add to that extraordinarily comprehensive assessment of what's going on right now, other than to say, last month I spent just over a week in two cities on the border, Ciudad Juarez and Matamoros. And going down, I had heard these stories that were reported about things like kidnapping, sexual assault, the kind of degraded conditions that asylum seekers are living in. And I still wasn't prepared for what it actually felt like to see them. So really, within just like moments of going to some of these shelters where the asylum seekers are sort of trapped, we were hearing stories of people being kidnapped, people who had gotten very sick along the journey. At one point in one of these tent camps, we'll actually see some footage of this in a few moments. There was a woman who was pregnant or had been pregnant when she had showed up to present herself for asylum, and she was told by a CBP officer that Donald Trump doesn't want pregnant women or kids in the country, so you should go get an abortion, and then sent her back. Now, it's tempting to hear a story like that and think, okay, that's crazy. This is just an outlier, awful story, but the actual reality is that right now what's happening at the border is completely unchecked. There's been, I think, the door opened to a kind of institutional cruelty that should worry and trouble and concern every single American, no matter what side of the political aisle you might find yourself on. There's so much that we could talk about, policy-wise and looking at the various routes that they're using specifically to dismantle the asylum system. And I'll show a video in a few moments to kind of break some of that down. But I think what we really need to confront and look in the face is that there's an official logic that's being used to convince people that this is all very normal. There's too many people who are coming in across the border. We can't accommodate everybody. And besides, most of them are just like fraudulent, or they're trying to quote unquote game the system anyway. I think we need to be very clear about calling things for what it is. I'm not sure if people saw this trove of emails that was released by SPLC a few days ago, where Stephen Miller, who's Trump's kind of like point immigration ghoul / henchman, who is linking reporters to white nationalist websites and sharing, racist, very clearly racist content. I think we need to be willing to cut through the official line that we're being told that this is just a sort of policy fix to fix things. Like, no, this is racism in action. The dismantling of the asylum system is motivated by racism. It's intended to protect white supremacy, and there's no rational basis for it. And it is, as she said a minute ago, actually getting people killed. So again, I thought that it was going to be sort of tough to find people who had the stories that we needed to find to really highlight what's happening, because we've been internally at the ACLU talking about how family separation was such a national issue. It was really something that captivated people. It brought people out on the streets. And for some reason, the asylum destruction, while it's being covered more and more, and I've heard that This American Life episode, I've had about seven people send that to me just in the past 4.5 hours, so it's clearly good. The whole sort of system that's being set up is in effect actually getting people hurt. So like I was saying, I thought, okay, finding people who have these stories is going to be tough, but it was just everywhere we went, it was like right in front of us, I was in one shelter at one point interviewing someone who was talking about when she was kidnapped by Mexican federal police, and we'll see some footage about that in a minute. And as I was interviewing her, there was a sound of crying that came from the room next to us in the shelter. It was a very sort of like wide open shelter in Ciudad Juarez, where there was like no security, totally anybody could come in and come out. We heard this crying in the room next to us, and this woman came out and she was wailing and sobbing, and the legal advocate that I was with asked her what was going on, and it turned out that her son had gone for a walk near the shelter that day and had been kidnapped. And she was just starting to get text messages from his abductors that were asking for money and laying out, how much it was going to cost. And it was like sort of hit me at that moment. I was like, oh, this is not the exception. This is the norm. And when I listened to press briefings by Mark Morgan, who's the acting chief of CBP, or, at one point, Kevin McAleenan, and these various people who are responsible for implementing this agenda, it just feels like fairy tale hour. They're telling people these things about what's happening at the border, and it's not very big of a deal. I think the thing I heard recently that was the most kind of astounding to me is he said that people are going to cartels for help, which, look, I'm sure that you can find one or two cases of somebody who's looking for a coyote to help them across the border or something like that. But the idea that these vulnerable people who are scared to leave their house are running around the streets of Nuevo Laredo and Matamoros trying to find cartel men to help them is just absolutely ludicrous. But it's like, this is the Orwellian reality, is if you just keep repeating a lie, there are people who will decide to embrace it because they want to. And this is why I think it's really important for us to educate ourselves about what's actually happening, because it's being done in our names, and be very, very forceful and clear, particularly with our representatives, that it's not okay and it's not normal. Because here's the reality. If we don't find ways to stop this and pull things back, because this is another thing, what I'm a little bit worried about right now, and we've had these conversations internally, is depending on if they're, the Democratic nominees, particularly centrist, let's say they get elected, I'm sure most people in this room would think that would be a good thing, it would. But there's going to be, I think, a temptation on that person's part, because it is true that there are a lot of people who are looking for asylum in the United States, to potentially just sort of say, okay, maybe this is a problem I don't have to handle. Just gonna quietly maybe make some tweaks around the edges, but leave the system in place where it is, and that can't happen. So there are ways that we can put pressure on our representatives and our congresspeople to kind of tell them that this is an important issue, and we're not willing to stand for it. Actually, this week is a really good week. If you did want to contact your representatives, we're calling it a week of action around asylum. There's a congressional hearing tomorrow about the forced return to Mexico policy. So this would be a great week if anybody feels inclined to get in touch with their representatives or something like that. So what I want to do right now, just to kind of break up the blah, blah, blahs, actually, let's hear from some people who are actually in this program. So that was the purpose of me taking this trip, is I can talk about this stuff endlessly, wax poetic, and try to get, paint a picture, but there's nothing like actually hearing it from people who are going through it. So I'm gonna play this little, we just put this out today. It's like a 5-minute explainer video.
Antes que me llevaran al hospital, un oficial me dijo que ese señor Trump no quería mujeres embarazadas ni mujeres conmigo, nada de eso quería, que mejor me abortara el niño.
The Trump administration's immigration crackdown on the southern border is expanding.
President Trump with a harsh message for migrants and asylum seekers.
Our country is full, can't take you anymore, so turn around, that's the way it is.
The Trump administration has put forth a set of policy changes aimed at their racist goal of limiting the access of immigrants of color to the United States across the border.
As you look at what's marching up. That's an invasion. That's an invasion.
And in the meantime, attempting to dismantle the asylum system that was set in place in post-World War II, when nations across the world came together, including the United States, to recognize that there was systems needed to ensure that people fleeing their home countries weren't returned or rejected into situations of extreme danger. Asylum seekers show up to a port of entry anywhere along the border. They're going to be rejected by a CBP officer and told to get on a list, or just tell them to come back at another time, or even things like asylum is no longer available to them. That's under a broad policy known as metering, where CBP illegally turns away people at ports of entry. If you are processed or you do cross in between a port of entry and are apprehended, you're now subjected to what's called the Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP, which is a program that forcibly returns people to Mexico to face ongoing dangers. People have been raped, kidnapped, extorted, and that policy is designed to prevent them from returning to the U.S. for a hearing before an immigration judge.
Llegando aquí a Juárez, estaban dos hombres vestidos de policía. Y nos pararon. Nosotros le planteamos la situación a los policías, pero ellos no sé qué habrá pasado, porque en ese momento ellos nos agarraron, daban así con unas capuchas de negro, ahí nos quitaron dinero, teléfonos y todo.
The administration has attempted to ban eligibility for asylum for the vast majority of people arriving on the border, including a ban that would require everyone to apply first in Mexico and be denied before being eligible for asylum. Mexican officials simply don't have the capacity or in some instances the willpower to ensure migrant safety. There's already been over 50,000 asylum seekers returned under the MPP program alone. There's an estimated close to 30,000 other migrants stuck on metering lists across the border. It's a massive population that Mexico simply doesn't have, the resources to protect.
Me vine por discriminación ante mí, por ser gay. Decidí venirme para Estados Unidos y resulta ser que llego a Estados Unidos y lo que hacen es que me mandan para México. Y aquí está peor la cosa más bien.
Every single migrant is extremely vulnerable in Mexico, particularly along the border.
The streets of Nuevo Laredo are often called Los Caminos de Carteles, the streets of the cartels, highly coveted smuggling routes, now a dumping ground for migrants.
We've seen cases of young women raped after return by CBP, kidnapped, disappeared. Groups like LGBTQ populations, pregnant women, and others don't have access to needed protections and resources in Mexico.
We're seeing a lot of flu. Coast living conditions don't help. The change in the weather doesn't help. We're having a lot of kids with high fevers, but everything in these situations is amplified. You can't treat things the same way that you do in the United States as you do here.
The bottom line is DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, is systematically returning people to known dangers, all in an effort to prevent them from asserting their right to seek asylum in the United States and accessing any form of due process. The counsel that they are given are a piece of paper with contact information for a handful of organizations that represent immigrants in border regions on the U.S. side of the border. Most of those organizations can't take cases of people that are in MPP because they can't travel to Mexico. They can't keep in touch with their clients because they're in such vulnerable and dangerous circumstances in Mexico and constantly having to move to stay alive. That is a purposeful design of the MPP system, is to keep people away from legal counsel.
It's hard. It's hard to plan your entire day because even though there's very little distance between us, we're still entering another country. Frankly, it could be several hours. It could be 1, 2, 3 hours. And that, you don't usually factor that in as an attorney, that commute time of waiting on the bridge.
I think it's incumbent on every person in the United States to reflect on whether the United States is a country who is living up to its supposed values. I think we put a lot of weight behind the idea that the U.S. is a country of immigrants, and I think the racism and white supremacy that has come into power in this government is playing out very clearly on the border in the brutalization of immigrants of color, and we all need to consider whether that is, a system that the United States should be propagating.
There's something that Shaw, who narrated that video, says that I think is very poignant, and accurate, where he said that the pain that people are going through needing to like move from place to place and escape danger, it's not a corollary effect of this policy. This policy is intended to hurt people. This is not like, oh, some people are gonna get a bit hurt as a result of this, but we're willing to make that sacrifice. This is a policy that has been created intentionally to cause pain to people. And the reason is, what they want is, frankly, they want people to be killed. They want people to be kidnapped, because then their relatives, they will go back home and they will say, don't try to come to the United States. I tried to do it. It was very dangerous. A friend of mine got kidnapped. A friend of mine got killed. We have no choice. We have to stay here. That's what they want. That's the intention. And I think, like, when you really look at it, there's also this idea that, okay, most people are economic migrants, right? Economic migrants, and it's like they're just looking for a job or something like that. We can, even setting aside whether that's an illegitimate reason to migrate, which I don't personally think it is, it's just not true. There are so many people who are stuck in these cities in Mexico who have extremely legitimate asylum claims. And it's not hard to find. Like I said, there was one woman in that video who was 19 years old, and she seemed like she was 14, just tiny, you know, just really like a teenager. She was a teenager. She's from Nicaragua, and she had participated in student-led marches against the government last year in 2018. A friend of hers was shot in the head right in front of her. There's a really brutal crackdown in Nicaragua after these protests, and you know, I think 350 people were killed. There was arrests, there was torture, and those kinds of things. And men actually visited her house and told her sister that they were going to come back and rape and kill this girl once they found her. Now, this is what the asylum system exists for, is to protect someone like that. This is not someone gaming the system. This is someone who has no choice but to find somewhere to go where they can find help. This system was put in place at the end of World War II because the world had a moment of having to look itself in the face and really own up to what collectively happened to Jewish people in the Holocaust, and say to themselves, never again. Next time people need help, we're gonna help them. And we're in the process right now of completely dismantling this system, and there's a very thin line that separates us from all-out barbarism, and I think that asylum is one of those lines, and it's very, very distressing that we're in the process of turning our backs on it. And I think we have a choice we have to make right now. Like, this is the moment, because these migration issues are not going to get easier. Climate change is coming. It's already a huge driver of migration. It's a huge driver of people seeking asylum, huge driver of conflict. So we have a choice about whether we're gonna just try to raise up the drawbridge and, you know, stick machine gun turrets up on the top of the bridge, or if we're gonna recognize that, like, the only way forward as human beings is for us to look at our problems collectively and find ways to take care of each other and move forward. And, you know, it's worth fighting. So thank you. I don't really know if I have anything else to say.
Thank you. Just feeling the heaviness, right, of those images, of this moment. So thank you. You know, we need to be with this. We need to be with this together. We need to get messages that give us an accurate picture of what's going on. And we need to stay in conversation about who we want to be. We're going to hear briefly from Carrie. Carrie Kuehl is the co-founder of Capital District Border Watch and coordinator of an Amnesty International group here in Albany. And tonight she's going to report on the Canadian efforts to challenge the Safe Third Country Agreement with the US and what that might mean for us.
Okay. Oh, okay, can everybody hear? Yes? Okay. I know that right now, this evening and in general in the US, we're very focused on not just Central America, but certainly on our southern border. But I want to talk about Canada. Since our 2016 election, approximately 50,000 people have crossed the border from the US into Canada in order to ask for asylum. 50,000 people. Even though we are focused on our southern border, Canada has received asylum seekers from all over the world. Many of them have not asked for asylum at an official border crossing because doing so would mean that they would be immediately returned to the United States. Since 2004, there's been a safe third country agreement between Canada and the United States. This agreement relies on the idea that both countries in question will guarantee the rights of asylum seekers and refugees as required by international law. So the Safe Third Country Agreement, the STCA, requires that people in the US or Canada request asylum in the first country where they set foot. So this means that with only if some exceptions, for example, if somebody already has close family members living in Canada, the STCA bars them from asking for asylum at a regular border crossing. From the beginning, Amnesty International and other human rights and refugee rights organizations have been opposed to this agreement. In 2017, in light of the increasingly harsh and xenophobic policies put in place by the Trump administration, 3 organizations, Amnesty International Canada, the Canadian Council for Refugees, and the Canadian Council of Churches, plus 1 individual asylum seeker with her children, initiated a legal challenge to the STCA in Canadian courts. In addition, the Canadian Council for Refugees and Amnesty International Canada have asked activists to sign petitions and to write letters to the federal government in Ottawa. So 2 weeks ago, the organizations challenging the STCA presented legal arguments in federal court in Toronto. The federal court heard evidence that when asylum seekers are turned away at Canadian border and sent back to be subjected to the flawed US asylum system, they often face lengthy and harsh detention, family separation, and serious ill treatment. They presented evidence that asylum seekers in detention are 5 times less likely than those who are free to win their asylum cases, 5 times less likely. Counsel Andrew Brower said, "It is incredibly difficult to make an asylum claim from a jail cell, particularly when access to legal and interpretation services are limited." And we certainly had an example of the difference that legal and interpreter services made here in Albany. On top of this, the detention conditions faced by STCA returnees are shameful. Treated like prisoners, those detained in the United States face inadequate health and mental health care, high rates of sexual assaults, physical violence, inadequate supplies of food and water, and several have spent time in solitary confinement. The physical and psychological impacts of these conditions are completely out of sync with international human rights standards and the Canadian Charter. People returned to the US are at high risk of being deported to their home country, back to the persecution, torture, and even death which they were fleeing. The risks are heightened for women fleeing gender-based violence when you think about the case of AG, because current US policy essentially closes the door on women's gender-based asylum claims. For example, in Toronto, they presented information about a woman from El Salvador who fled violence by the MS-13 gang. She discovered that her claim would likely not be successful in the US, so she turned to Canada for protection, but only to be turned back to the US. Another asylum seeker returned by Canada to the US spent 20 months in detention in the United States before being deported back to his country of origin, where he experienced extreme violence. So refugee rights advocates believe that the continued application of the Safe Third Country Agreement violates the rights to equality, life, liberty, and the security of the person under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as well as Canada's obligations under international law. The STCA, however, doesn't bar people who are traveling through the US or who are residents of the US from seeking asylum if they enter somewhere that is not an official border crossing. So the STCA actually encourages people to cross the border irregularly and unsafely, sometimes putting their lives at risk. So in the winter of 2016, Seydou Mohammed and Razak Iyal lost all of their fingers to frostbite after losing their way while walking through farmers' fields while they were trying to cross from the US into Manitoba province. A 57-year-old grandmother, also from Africa, died of hypothermia while trying to cross into Manitoba in the winter of 2017. But tragically, she actually might have been eligible for refugee status because she hoped to rejoin family already living in Toronto. So the organizations which advocate withdrawing from the STCA believe that by doing so, Canada would ensure that the country meets its legal obligations, and withdrawal would also allow people to enter Canada in an orderly way through official ports of entry, ending irregular crossings. One unauthorized crossing, which has become very well known and actually very well organized, is Roxham Road. It's a small country road that leads from Champlain, New York, up to Hemingford, Quebec. There now is actually regular taxi service from Plattsburgh to the border and 24/7 RCMP presence. And when people cross, RCMP agents, the Mounties, they turn border crossers over to immigration authorities to begin the asylum claim process. According to a researcher who interviewed 290 people who crossed at Roxham Road, these were people who came from countries including Haiti, Nigeria, Colombia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. 60% of them spent an average of just 5 days in the US before crossing the border. About 40% of the people he interviewed were undocumented residents of the US who had overstayed a visa or had been given a negative decision on an asylum claim in the US. Some of the people who asked for asylum at Roxham Road had already lived in the US for several years. Around 3,500 US citizens asked for asylum in Canada between April 2017 and June 2019, according to Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, which is the ministry in charge of immigration and asylum. And probably most of those 3,500 US citizens were children of undocumented parents in families that have mixed status. So in response to this large number of asylum seekers, because remember that there have now been 50,000 people who have crossed, the federal parliament approved last spring a controversial new regulation, which was included in a budget bill, which prohibits people who have already asked for asylum in the US, the UK, Australia, or New Zealand from seeking asylum in Canada. No one who is ineligible for asylum under this new regulation, though, will be immediately deported, unlike what might happen in the US. They will first have a risk assessment hearing. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also created a new cabinet-level position which never existed before. Think about the prominence of DHS, Homeland Security here in the States. he created about a year and a half ago a Minister of Border Security and Organized Crime Reduction. But however, most matters related to immigration or asylum are not the responsibility of Bill Blair, who is a former Toronto police chief, the Minister of Border Security. Beginning in 2017, a member of Parliament chosen to be head of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada was Ahmed Hussein. He is a first-generation Somali refugee, lawyer, and member of Parliament from the Toronto area. That's such a contrast. While asylum seekers await their hearing before the Immigration and Refugee Board, they are eligible for a work permit, health care, and social assistance, which is what we would call welfare, and their children may attend public schools. The provinces and municipal governments are responsible for providing housing and social services. Quebec province, with which I'm most familiar, and which has welcomed a huge proportion of the asylum seekers, has its own Ministry of Immigration. And it offers really generous support to individuals who have made an asylum application. And I copied a quote from their website, from the English version of the website for you. And it says, "Are you living in Quebec while your asylum application is being reviewed? You are entitled to services from the government of Quebec upon your arrival. Namely," and here are all 10 services: temporary housing upon arrival in Quebec. 2, assistance finding permanent housing on the private market. 3, information sessions about life in Quebec. 4, last resort financial assistance. 5, preschool, elementary, and secondary education. 6, non-subsidized childcare and community drop-in daycare activities. 7, universal employment services. 8, French language classes. 9, legal aid to prepare asylum claims in particular. 10, social services under the Programme Régional d'accueil et d'intégration des demandeurs d'asile, the regional program for the welcoming and integration of asylum seekers, psychosocial services provided by social workers, and health, frontline, and preventative services adapted to the needs of people seeking asylum, unquote. Almost too good to be true? You're probably thinking, surely there must be a lot of anti-immigrant backlash, isn't there? Well, Canada settled 25,000 Syrian refugees in 2015 and 2016. And a lot of that was done by people creating groups of citizens who said that they would take responsibility for helping the Syrians to be integrated into Canadian society, not for 3 months, but for 1 year. And Canada is very conscious of having a labor shortage because the total population is only, in a very rounded figure, 37 million. So generally, there's an effort that's made when there are international students. There's a real effort to get them to stay in the country after graduation, including graduate studies. There are some small anti-immigrant groups. For example, in Quebec, there's a group called La Meute, which means the wolf pack, and in other provinces. But from my time being a student there, from having close friends up in Quebec, and from following the news there daily, whether it's newspaper or radio, my feeling is that white nationalism has so much less importance than it does here or also in Europe. In the federal parliament, only one party, the official opposition Conservative Party, which gained the second most votes in the October 2019 election campaigned on the idea of closing the loophole where people could cross where it wasn't an official border in the STCA. But they didn't even really propose a concrete plan for how they would do this. The Liberal Party under Justin Trudeau, who did win the election, is generally pro-immigration, but still they've talked about updating or renegotiating the STCA with the US. And there's a real suspicion that what they'd like to do is they'd like to be able to turn back a lot more asylum seekers to the US. But our government has been too busy pushing people back to Mexico to respond. There are 3 other parties in federal parliament: the New Democratic Party, the Greens, and the Bloc Québécois, and they all favor suspending or completely rescinding, completely doing away with the STCA, because they do not believe that the US government offers sufficient protection to asylum seekers, refugees, and immigrants. Along with human rights organizations, they believe that by continuing to accept the United States as a, quote, safe country, unquote, Canada is complicit in the ill treatment and deportation of asylum seekers. So those provinces, not all of them have, but those provinces who have welcomed asylum seekers, there isn't a lot of backlash. What there seems to be is some complaints, mainly that the federal government is too slow to compensate them for the share of the expenses that the federal government agreed to pay. While I was doing research to be able to give this talk, I read sources that came from outside Amnesty International Canada or the CCR, the Council for Refugees. And some writers wonder if rescinding the STCA would actually attract even more asylum seekers, causing a backlash by Canadian citizens. The decision of the federal court might be months away. And also in the federal parliament, the Liberals, who form a minority government, are going to need votes from other parties to pass any laws which require parliamentary approval. So, at least for now, Canada and Quebec continue to offer some kind of hope to people who certainly can no longer find it here in the States. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carrie. It's wonderful to just have a sense of what an integrated view of asylum and the services might be, and that beautiful description in Quebec of what we would want to be able to offer people coming from very dangerous situations and needing support and reintegration. I think when there's this much of an erosion of what asylum is, we forget what we truly would want to offer. So it's beautiful to have that image, as well as to know people up there are aware of how dangerous it is to be in the United States and how unlikely you are to gain asylum here. So thank you for that. So we're going to open it up to a conversation here. We welcome any of your questions. So we'll take a few questions, and then I'll look at the list that we have about some ideas of what we might do together to kind of move this forward here in the community. So could someone grab that other mic over there?
Well, my question is what you just said. You're going to talk, what can we do? Here.
Okay, let's get a little bit of a list of what we can do. So these are the notes that I took down. Sarah talked about the teachers who were doing a meal for the day in refugee camps, so we could do some research and figure out, you know, do we want to organize to do a meal for a day in refugee camps? We all have to listen to the podcast, This American Life, so that we can, you know, just gain some more information about really the intricacies and emotional world of the border guards and the refugee situation. Sarah talked about volunteering for several organizations that are active at the border. So we have a couple of ideas about sending people to the border, working for organizations. And those of you who saw the movie Witness at Tornillo, there's a gathering that's going to be organized by Josh Rubin on January 12th. We already have some folks from Albany who want to go down and be part of that. So that idea that we're going to send people down, bring people back, offer services there, and keep a sense of continuity and connection to the border. Pressure our representatives regarding erosion of the asylum program, and looking very particularly right now at the hearings related to the MPP program that are in place, to talk to our representatives about those hearings. So those are the ideas I garnered from what we were talking. So let's hear some other ideas people have, or some support for any of those ideas.
Hi, and my question is not exactly straight on the line of what you asked. But anyway, I wonder what's going on with Scott's trial, wherever it is. What?
Scott Warren is a volunteer with No More Deaths who is accused of harboring refugees and charges related to illegal humanitarian aid. Do we have an answer on Scott Warren's trial?
Yeah, I haven't been following as closely as I should. I know there was a recent victory, but then I think the government brought up new charges.
I feel like it was a hung jury, and I think
November 12th, they were going back to court on November 12th. So those deliberations are going on now, is my sense. Anyone out there have an update on Scott Warren, No More Deaths? Okay, we'll have to look that up.
Hi, thank you very much. I mean, this is all horrifying, and it is undermining the very basis of what we're supposed to be doing as the United States. What can we do to make the asylum policies part of the election process that we're going through, so that candidates have to address asylum policies directly? I think if people talk more generally about immigration, but they aren't talking specifically about asylum, and we should. It's a humanitarian cause, and they should have to say how they feel about it. I don't know what we can do to demand that.
Whichever candidate you support right now, when the debates come up, it's important to reach out to the offices of the candidate in the primary candidates that you support right now, to say this is an issue that's important to me, and my votes are important to you, and if you donate, my dollars are important to you. On the press side, I'm not sure what can be done, because the debate questions are generated through a combination of, I believe, the Democratic Party, National Party, and then whichever press outlet is hosting the debate. So I don't think we have a ton of opportunity to influence that. But if you pressure the candidates, then they can, through their campaign structure, pressure the organizers of the debates. And that happened early on. The first Democratic primary debate, every candidate had to talk about specific provisions of immigration law, which was highly unusual. But that was, I think, riding on the end of family separation. I guess the point is to be loud. The louder you are, the more responsive they are.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to add to that, just make noise any way you can, I mean, it sounds sort of trite, because I know there's only so much we can accomplish using social media, but especially on forums like Twitter, if you have a Twitter account, there'll be a hashtag tomorrow, #SaveAsylum. Maybe throw a couple of tweets out into the ether. I mean, you do get political candidates, campaign staff that pay attention to those kinds of things. It's like if they feel that there's some groundswell of, concern over an issue, smart candidates will try to use that to their advantage. So yeah, right. I mean, like she said, write letters, call. People actually pay attention to those calls too. Yeah, I mean, you could always donate to organizations that are doing advocacy on this too. There's no good answer to that.
We have a question here in the back.
There is another, I don't know if you called a bill, but a budget bill coming up. And some organizations, I don't remember specifics, are asking people to make calls to their representative in Congress and to their senators' offices in Washington, D.C. The way to do that is to find a switchboard number for the Capitol, and then you can just ask for whoever it is you want to talk to and talk to a staff member and say, please decrease funding for ICE and for the CBP in the budget.
So I had a question and a comment. Actually, today, my family and I, we had my cousin come from Venezuela, and he's seeking asylum as well, because as you might know, there's like a lot of governmental issues going on over there. There's a lot of people that need food, are homeless. I actually witnessed a lot of that when I was in Ecuador. A lot of people are coming in from Venezuela trying to even go into Ecuador. There's probably about 1,000 people at the immigration border from Venezuela and Ecuador. He was in the Texas, the deportation center in Texas for about 2 months when he came here. My dad just flew out to Atlanta to go over there, and we ended up having to pay $12,500 just to get him out of the center. And that's not anything included. That's just getting him out of there and getting him out of like those terrible conditions that he had to stay in. My other cousin and her son, who is 3 years old, were lucky enough to get over here without having to like stay in there for too long. They did have to stay in there for a while, but they were let out sooner than him. Well, my question kind of ties in with that. I feel like that question, like that has like a lot to do with my like personal family and stuff, and I don't really think like a lot of people my age are educated about what's going on right now. So I want to like know how to kind of get younger people like around like 18, like the new voters, like more involved in it, and like how can I do that?
Wow. I was going to ask how old you are because I didn't want to make any assumptions about your age, but we'll say 18, right?
Well, I'm 17. Yeah, I was actually emailing you.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So we'll definitely hook you up with organizations that can help handle those cases. The students at my law clinic can't assist with those types of cases because they're just so complicated. But we have USCRI and others in the room who might be able to find. In the Capital District, we all kind of band together, so we should be able to hook your family up with lawyers that can help. Your story's not unusual, unfortunately, that everybody sort of gasped at that number. That's typically a bond amount that's being set now. That happens in Batavia, just 4 hours west of here. And the amounts range depending on whichever immigration judge is hearing your bond request. It could be anywhere from $2,500 to over $20,000. It just depends. We recently had a case where someone was let out the first time on $15,000, sorry. And then we fought the case in federal court. We challenged his detention. We said the government screwed up. He also became eligible for a visa. And when they let him out this last time, inexplicably, they dropped it to $2,500. So like, there's just no rhyme or reason to that. And unfortunately, we hear those stories a lot. How can young people educate each other, or how can they plug in, right? I think you guys know best. I think there's a failure of the American political system right now in this moment generally to listen to people that age, to the extent that, the March for Our Lives movement, which was a bunch of young people exactly in that age demographic, organized themselves to march on Washington around gun violence in schools. I have a niece who's particularly outspoken about Black Lives Matter on Instagram, and she's been effective at running for office in her school and then making that a platform of what she's doing in her school, which never would have happened when I was in high school. Our platforms were around school lunches and like what after school activities were available. I think this generation is doing awesome, incredible things, and that we're not plugging in enough as adults in the room to hear their voices. And so I think we need to do a better job of actually listening to you. But if you're looking to educate your peer group, the clip that you saw just now from the ACLU, right? It's like 6 minutes. It's pretty accessible. I love their graphics. I kind of want to use them in my law school classes to explain the differences between the MPP and the other things, right? Because it makes it very clear. That's something that you could talk to your teachers about presenting. And to the extent that you feel comfortable telling your story, that's probably the most compelling thing of all.
The only thing I would add to that is that not long ago, there was a 29-year-old bartender serving up drinks in New York City, thinking, what can she do to do something about the world that she's in? And now she's in Congress, and she's probably like the most important politician in the country. One of them, right? Let your voice be heard if you care about this stuff. I mean, it's like, there's no choice. You know, I feel like my generation, God, I'm already talking about my generation. Fuck.
Gen X.
I'm still a millennial, cuss.
I'm old.
My generation could kind of tune out a little bit. Like, I felt like if you were like an activist personality a little bit, it was kind of like, oh God, like, shut the fuck up. But like now, the world is in such bad shape that like you are gonna have to step up. And if you do, people are gonna gravitate towards you. They're gonna support you because we need solutions. So I think everybody knows that, whether they're 17, 38, 60, whatever the case may be. So I mean, I think I would just be like, if you want people to care, and tell them why they should care too.
I think what you just did right now actually was very powerful. So keep doing what you're doing.
Great. I just want to add that I was a 17-year-old activist, and I'm an activist now. So just keep going.
We're loud.
Hi, my name's Michael Crowell. I'm new in the area. I just moved here a few weeks ago. And you mentioned earlier about possibilities of going to the border and getting involved in work. I speak decent Spanish, and so I'd be interested in hooking up with local stuff going on here, and also possibly going down to the border to get involved in some stuff.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really glad you moved to the area. We're really happy to have you. And I hope you signed up for Capital District Border Watch for our email list, because we're going to be focusing on this in the next couple of months, is figuring out who's going down there and how to support them from here.
I volunteered in El Paso, Texas with Annunciation House, and the Unitarian Social Justice Committee organized the people volunteering there. Are you talking about going across the border to Nuevo Laredo or Ciudad Juarez? I also speak Spanish. And the other thing I wanted to ask, Sarah, is this the legal project? Is that part of Albany Law School? Because I have a Honduran family I'm working with whose teenage sons were just brought over after 3 months at the border by the Legal Project brought here.
Yeah, we work with the Legal Project. They're a separate nonprofit organization. So I'm an immigration law professor, and then I teach my students through practice. So we take on a much smaller docket in order for the students to learn through practice. So the lion's share of the immigration legal services that are being provided in this area are by USCRI, who already connected with our young activists in the back. the Legal Project, Prisoners Legal Services, and legal aid is able to assist some folks in certain circumstances. They can't represent most undocumented folks because of funding restrictions, because they're federally funded.
So the boys 13 and 15 years old were 3 months at the border with the coyote trying to get over, so I know very well what the families have gone through and what they went through.
Yeah, and if you can support these organizations, they're all nonprofits. They're all nonprofit groups that are working really, really hard. And if you want to be, if you want more information about what resources are available, we also have our Office for New Americans, which is a new-ish office in the governor's, that the New York governor, Andrew Cuomo, has established in order to help folks once they're here.
Hi. I'm wondering if there are any actual laws being broken, state, federal, international, Geneva Conventions, any treaties being broken, and if they aren't, the entire Nuremberg trials were based on misconduct that was not illegal at the time. And, you know, Albany Law School Judge Robert Jackson,
that's right,
was the chief prosecutor. So, based on some of that idea, Baltasar Garzón of Spain brought charges against Pinochet of Chile. Now, it seems that not only is the White House people vulnerable to charges for directing this intentional mistreatment of people to discourage migrants, but the actual people right down to the bottom line are perhaps carrying out crimes of some sort. So is there, or is the legal system just helpless?
No, that's some of what we're trying to get at, right? I mean, in terms of international law, I also hold an LLM in international law and a master's in diplomacy and international relations. So to the extent that I can speak to those issues, it's really, I would expect to see in the near future, if there aren't already suits brought before the Inter-American Commission, which is actually located in Washington, D.C., but has ruled against the United States and found the United States in violation of the American Convention, which we are a signatory to. So it is binding law. So the Inter-American Convention, the Inter-American Commission will likely hear a case or hundreds of them in the future. I would wager a guess. The international community right now, and a lot of what happens in international law has to do with name and shame the conduct. And the problem here is that the United States controls most of those mechanisms, right? So the idea that the United Nations might, we are pulling ourselves out of very important United Nations commissions as well, commissions on human rights, other things in these international organizations. So we won't know what the international response is for a while. In the interim, some of these Supreme Court cases that are winding their way through are chipping away at protections. Some of those protections are found in the Bivens doctrine, which my esteemed colleague right behind you, Professor Gottlieb, might be able to speak more to, but essentially there are federal protections that protect individual actors from liability when they're operating as officials of the federal government. But what you're getting at is that's exactly how we held people accountable post-World War II, which served as the foundation for human rights law. So we'll see what these horribles produce in the legal system in terms of, it's definitely fertile soil for a new rights regime. It just depends on whether or not our current Supreme Court has the guts to do it. And I'm less convinced that the majority of the members of that court are gonna get the job done. But we'll see. The cross-border shooting case, United States versus Mesa, I think it is called, is one to watch. I'm also going to be writing a law review article about remedies for family separation. The court recently ordered in the family separation cases that the federal government provide psychological services to the families who were separated. That's a start. It's not, a tribunal. It's not criminal justice, but it's a start.
we're suing.
Oh, yeah.
Could a local county district attorney press charges for kidnapping against an individual?
I would love to see one try. The ACLU right now is, we're suing for damages for parents who are subjected to family separation. I mean, one answer to your question is all of these policies are illegal. They're clear violations of both US law and the international law. But, you know, whether the Supreme Court is gonna rule in our favor, it's not particularly looking great, but we've gotten a number of pretty good rulings from lower courts. The Ninth Circuit's been pretty good for us. And we have a couple of cases that are winding its way through that process right now. It's just the concern is we get these preliminary injunctions or we outright win a case, then the Supreme Court steps in and kind of overturns it. So, you know, elections have consequences.
Hi, yes, thank you so much for all of your great work and for certainly helping enlighten us tonight. Just a couple of practical questions. Is the clip that you showed available on the ACLU website?
It is as of today. Yeah.
As of today, okay,
Cool.
great.
It's actually, it won't be tweeted until tomorrow, but you can find it on our website because tomorrow is this day of actions. That was what we're using
tomorrow.
to
All right,
publicize. Yep.
What's it called on the website, he would like to know?
Yeah. The video, what's the video called? I think it's like Asylum Explainer or something. I don't I have to check my.
We'll find, I'm sure we'll find it.
Yeah, just check our Twitter account tomorrow.
And then, so a second question, you started to tell us what we could do in terms of contacting our representatives. Could you just be a little bit more explicit about that?
Yeah, we have a couple of specific asks of Congress. The one that we're kind of focusing our energy right now is defunding DHS. So Remain in Mexico is a part of that because it's financed by the same pool of money that goes to the Department of Homeland Security. But I think it's just find the addresses of your representatives and senators and write to them, call them, and be very specific that I would actually recommend that like the best course of action is to do a little bit of research on the specifics of what's being broken with the asylum system and say, for example, end Remain in Mexico immediately, pass legislation that overrides the Safe Third Countries Agreement. The more specific you are, I think, the more compelling that ask is, but yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything?
There are organizations like the American Immigration Council and others that, and is really the ACLU is chief on this, where there are templates that you can cut and paste to submit via the email portals that every elected representative has. I want to actually pivot from federal contacts because it's, Gillibrand, Schumer, Tonko for most of you. So
Delgado for us.
And Delgado?
Yeah, we're Delgado.
And I recently met with Representative Delgado on issues involving immigration, and these issues were raised to him. I think his office will be particularly receptive to hear from you about the border funding. You can call his office directly, and he has a staff member who's assigned to immigration issues, and she's highly responsive. I forgot her name. I think it's Emily. But you should just ask for the immigration liaison in Congressman Delgado's office, and you can actually speak to a real life human being instead of just sending off emails. I would also turn your attention to the state government. New York State's going to have a couple of bills up for consideration that we need people to be really loud about. One is keeping ICE out of our courthouses. That bill made a lot of ground last session. It didn't make it into any final packages, but it's a very important bill. The court system has declared, has put rules in place around ICE presence in and around courthouses, but they're insufficient. We need state legislation. There's also a pending lawsuit about that, and I've been on an amicus brief about that. That's happening here in New York State. And your Albany County Sheriff has already kicked them out of the county courthouses and the jail, which is why you're not hearing about any of that anymore. Another bill that will be kicking around New York State to pay attention to, that the New York State Bar Association just announced recently, is a bill that would make immigration lawyers mandatory, make immigration lawyers available to anyone who's facing removal proceedings in New York State. So in New York City and in Buffalo, anybody who's facing removal proceedings would get a lawyer. In New York, we already have lawyers funded for people who are detained and in removal proceedings. But this would expand that to anyone who's facing removal. And it would be, state provided. It's $16 million a year right now to help provide lawyers for people who are facing immediate removal and detention. It's a fight every year to get that back in the budget. Be loud about funding for lawyers for immigrants in New York State. You can make a much bigger difference by being loud here in your home state, especially with the capital a stone's throw away.
Okay, just one last brief. You mentioned several organizations that are working at the border, and we should support them. Is there a list somewhere?
Yeah, it's that pesky podcast I just listened to. And there are two different groups that are organized, and one of them was actually highlighted in the ACLU video. The woman, it said the name of her organization. It was like Global World Rescue, or that one.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't remember what it's called. I think it's called a Global Health Alliance or something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Watch the video.
Watch the video. It's there. And they're great. They're great.
Yeah.
There's also an organization called I think it's the Committee for Human Rights and Constitutional Law. It was formed as part of the Flores Agreement, and they have a project called Reunify. If you look at reunify.org, this is the only organization with standing to go into the places where children are being kept. They bring lawyers, they bring interpreters, they bring social workers, and people from this region are going to the border, but also working in New York State for kids who are in detention in New York State. So if you look at reunify.org, you'll find out about that.
Do we have a final question?
My question might be, it's a little bit on the mundane side in the scale of things, but I'm always struck by the stories about the ice boxes. And my understanding is that those predate this administration, and that makes me think that there is a culture around Border Patrol that when they try to say, those are bad actors, those are outliers, but the consistent story about the ice boxes tells me that it's ingrained in the way that it operates. So my question is, to me, as a non-legal person, that sounds like torture. And I'm wondering if there has been legal action taken about the ice boxes.
Yeah, the ice boxes are rooms that people were held in very cold conditions for days on end, and people would lose consciousness, and babies would lose weight, and that has been going on for a very long time. And that was under the Bush administration, the Obama administration, certainly this administration. And the Flores Agreement was designed to get at that for kids who are held in those conditions. You mentioned Flores earlier. That's the settlement. Judge Dolly G in the Ninth Circuit presides over that settlement, and she has to keep invoking it over and over and over again because the government keeps violating it, basically setting minimum conditions for standards of care for children in DHS custody. Still a problem. And if we can't solve it for kids, the likelihood that we're going to be able to solve it for the grown-ups is not, I'm not optimistic about that. There's a lot of talk around sort of not participating in the detention industrial complex. paying attention to where your investments are and to the companies that your investments invest in are really important. And if you have a broker or somebody that you can call, if you are in a situation where you have a broker, it's worth a phone call to say, what is my money funding? There are banks that have had to divest from funding mass detention because their customers said, we will take our money elsewhere. And in a capitalist society, you as a consumer have a lot of power with your dollars. So paying attention to where your money is going, even if it's not that much, it's still part of a bigger fund that might be funding these global, these large detention private companies.
One thing I just want to kind of like touch on that I feel like you brought up there that's very, very important is, and I feel like I'm kind of preaching to the choir here. I'm sure people here know this already, but there's a little bit of a tendency, I think, in some places for people to think, well, this is all happening because Donald Trump was president, right? Before Donald Trump was president, we were kind to immigrants, we treated them well, and then this is just a unique crisis. The moment that we get him out of office, everything's gonna go back to being normal, and that is not the case. There were massive abuses being carried out in the immigration system under Barack Obama. His record on deportations for so-called criminal offenses in the first 6 years of his term is atrocious. Detentions of children, et cetera, things that happen on the border. And actually, if you trace back some of the worst abuses that are happening in the system right now, they come from laws that were signed into effect by Bill Clinton. Kind of bipartisan sort of compromises, the AID-PUD, the IRA. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's the basic point. That's like, things aren't going to just clean themselves up with a change of power in Washington unless there's consistent and ongoing pressure to really unwind 30 years of this enforcement brutality mentality of, punish immigrants, get as many of them out of the country as we can. So it's not like we want to go back to something before Trump. We actually want to go forward to something that's better.
So I want to thank our presenters and everybody for coming here to be part of a difficult but powerful conversation about what are our next steps. Thank you again, everybody.